Brechen mir die Fies von Trottoiren.
10 years ago, in the remote Ukrainian town of Chernivtsi, I recorded a sound I hadn't heard since I was a toddler.
Schlaf ich auf die Bank von die Boulevarden, ingerig mit Nos.
And when the BBC asked me to make a programme about the Yiddish language, I thought about returning to the city my Russian grandmother would have called Czernowitz. But if you want to hear Yiddish today, there's no point in going to Czernowitz. Hitler wiped out most of the language, and the USSR all but finished the job. The story of the near death of Yiddish in Europe and its rebirth in the USA has been a lifetime study for the Yiddish academic Dr. Miriam Hoffman.
It's a language that has no luck at all. It's a very unlucky language. But it is so vital and so strong and so full of life and joie de vivre and all of that, it refuses to die.
So to hear Yiddish as a living language, there's only one destination. Not Bukovina, but Brooklyn, in what Jewish migrants called the Golden Medina, New York. How did a migrant tongue survive for more than a century? Not in its birthplace of Central and Eastern Europe, but in the powerhouse of the English-speaking world. And what are its chances over the next 100 years? That's what I came to New York to find out. The Yiddish masses first huddled in New York's Lower East Side as refugees from the Russian pogroms in the 1890s. So it seemed a good idea to start my search in the heart of the East Side in Delancey Street.
11:45, piecing it together. Great, if you can all stand over there for me, that'd be excellent. Thank you so much.
I tagged onto a tour of the few surviving tenements where the city's first Yiddish speakers took refuge.
In 1897, we have the Levine couple in this apartment. It's Harris and Jenny Levine. They're both from Plonsk, which is near Warsaw in Poland. They're Polish Jews. They're married over there in Plonsk, and they traveled to the U.S. on their honeymoon, traveling steerage.
Harris and Jenny Levine, like many of their Jewish contemporaries, made their living in the schmutter business, the rag trade.
Harris, is going to become the sewing machine operator in his own shop. He's going to make anywhere between $12 to $18 a month for that.
Dirt poor and barely literate in English, Harris and Jenny would certainly have plied their trade in Yiddish. But what was that jargon which echoed along Delancey Street? Well, Yiddish is Jüdisch, the German word for Jewish. It's the old Middle German that migrant Jews carried from Western Europe to the borders of Russia. And along the way, bits of other languages stuck to its skin. Miriam Hoffman.
Every word contains history, tradition, custom, holiday, Hebrew element, that's the sacred tongue, Aramaic, Greek, Latin, Old French, Old Italian. They're so full of weight, these words. It's not like you speak a language and then you can throw it away. It's 1,000 years old.
Like Miriam Hoffman, the Yiddish poet and songwriter Bela Gottesman is a refugee from Eastern Europe. She also comes from Czernowitz, a crucial city in Yiddish history. It's where European Jews held a conference 100 years ago to establish Yiddish as their lingua franca.
Levone, Levone, du bist da so schön, wenn du scheinst in der finsterer Nacht. Nur sag mir vor was, du hast nicht kein Not, und die Augen hast du vermacht.
Levone, Levone, wo bist da so freilich, wenn du scheinst in der finsteren Nacht? Bist die am Malkitzi, bist die am Melach, sitz ich beim Fenster und tracht.
Levone, Levone, auf dem Himmel da.
Bela's granddaughter Esther is a singer, and she was born on this side of the Atlantic. 2 generations separated by 60 years and 5,000 miles, sharing one language in the Golden Medina.
Mein Heim, New York.
My home, New York.
Schämst sich auszusagen, als der Keulenporer, Gasolinreuer, der wilde Getummel.
You're ashamed to confess it. that the coal dust, the gasoline smoke, the wild noise, the impetuous tumult is your home and you love it. You won't admit that your life, like the paved asphalt, has become congealed, stone cold, not uttering a word to anyone for days on end, and this has become the pattern of your life, in fact, your preference. What is there to boast about? Those who don't understand won't agree, and the others, in any event, think it's the best home anywhere.
Ze is de beste van alle heimen.
Esther, which do you prefer, the Yiddish or the English?
They're totally different animals.
What's the difference between the two?
It's like in any language. There are certain words that can only be said by a certain language. It's like just
a poem translated. You cannot translate a poem. It's a wrong question, because the Yiddish has a rhyme, it has a rhythm, it is made especially for this genre, for this language. In English I would write it all different.
Yiddish writing is buried in my memory too. 40 years ago, I remember my grandmother reading a Yiddish newspaper called the Jewish Daily Forward, sent to her by my aunt in Queens. Every week she'd await the stories of Isaac Bashevis Singer, the only Yiddish writer to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. The Forward started as a socialist broadsheet, and it quickly grew into the city's principal Jewish journal, and a kind of early internet for its Jewish community. And it's still alive today. The current publisher is Sam Norwich.
It became, of course, the accompanist, the background music. It became the voice. It became the school. It became the library. It became the window on the wider world for 1 million American Jews just off the boat from Eastern Europe who had had no previous experience with democracy, had no previous experience with being members of a polity themselves, had only had the experience of being a minority and not always a enfranchised minority. The Forward was the springboard into America. It provided the fuel. It provided the impetus. It was denounced by some of its writers and adherents as being assimilationist, but for American Jews that was the whole point.
If the Forward was the brain of Yiddish New York, its heart was in the Yiddish theatre. At one time there were 12 playhouses on 2nd Avenue performing in Yiddish. Stars were mobbed in the streets, just like George Clooney or J-Lo today, and they had equally lavish lifestyles. The theatre was a meeting place for the community and a repository for its culture and customs. Over the years, the inflections of Yiddish slipped into Broadway and Hollywood and Tin Pan Alley. Zalman Mlotek is the artistic director of the city's last surviving professional Yiddish theatre, the Volksbühne.
One of the exciting things about Yiddish is how Yiddish song informs Jewish life. So, for instance, a Taylor song like Otazoi Neta Schneider, Otazoi Neta Doch. This is how a tailor sews. That's the translation. Neta Doch, Enetu Neta ganze Woch. He sews and sews a whole week. Verdient Gilden mit a Loch. And he makes a wooden nickel, as we would translate it. Enetu Neta ganze Woch. Verdient Gilden mit a Loch. Otazoi Neta Schneider, Otazoi Neta Doch. Otazoi Neta Schneider, Otazoi Neta Doch. One of the very interesting things about this particular song is that the great jazz song stylist and African-American performer Cab Calloway speaks about hearing this very song, Otazoi, heard in the suburbs of Baltimore as he grew up. And he heard his mother sing this song, which is very possible because the tenements were so close together. And he recorded this version. My mama used to sing to me a plaintive little melody, and where that melody came from, I swear I'll never know. Now that I'm a citizen, the tune comes back to me again. And as I sing the story, I'll sing just how it goes. Ot azay, says the tailor, as he fashions pretty clothes. Ot azay, says the tailor, as he sews and sews and sews. He's as busy as can be, making lovely finery, things my baby loves to wear when I take her to the fair. Ot azay, says the tailor, as he fashions pretty clothes. Ot azay, says the tailor, as he sews and sews and sews. Well, so there are songs like that that give pictures of how Yiddish songs came into the American milieu.
I mean, I've heard from various people that there's a lot of Yiddish in early jazz, early 1920s jazz.
Oh yeah. Well, you know, I mean, Gershwin. We don't have to go very far. I mean, you don't have to. I mean, you don't have to really go very far to hear the influences. And Gershwin himself spoke about his going to the Yiddish theater, and he talks about hearing this very song, Schlaf mein Fegele. This is a song that he heard his mother sing, a Yiddish folk song. Mach zu die Egelach, sleep my little bird, close your little eyes. Schlaf mein tired Kind, sleep my dear child. Schlaf mein Fegele, mach zu die Egele, schlaf mein tired. Well, in George and Ira Gershwin's hands, it became this. My one and only, what are you gonna do if you turn me down? I am so crazy over Schlaf mein Fegele. My one and only, what are you gonna do if you turn me down? I am so crazy over you, and many, many other examples like that.
Soll beweisen, dass is Gittler, weil ich ihm geben das Fingerl.
100 years ago, the Volksbühne Company performed in a grand downtown brownstone. Now they squat in a bland institutional back room on 33rd Street. No more screaming crowds and paparazzi.
Gib mir up das Fingerl. Ich will doch stellen nach Chippe.
Also, geben dir das Fingerl. Und öfter praven dir a Chassen an euch. Ich bin noch, Gott sei Dank, nicht mehr schicke.
Ich will ihm die Töffel aussetzen.
Sie jagt sich nicht. Als die was aussetzen, wird man dich einsetzen.
Was tut man? Was tut man an Eize? Seht, nur dort bin weit, dacht sich Herschel geht daher, ein Ezerbau geht Herschel, Herschel, Herschel!
Do you guys do this for a living? Seriously, is this what you do all the time?
You can't make a living from Yiddish theater alone.
So what do you do when you're not doing Yiddish theatre?
Well, I'm a librarian.
I work at an ad agency.
I work in real estate development.
I'm a cantor at a synagogue.
I'm a graduate student at the Jewish Theological Seminary.
Here you all are from your various different backgrounds, and you're performing Yiddish theatre let's say semi-professionally. You're professionals, but actually you can't make a living at it. What kind of future is there for a company like this?
How old is the Volksbühne now, Zalman? 90, how many years?
Yeah, I mean, the Volksbühne is in existence, this is its 93rd consecutive season. So there have been hundreds of Yiddish actors that have made a living. When we say, making a living and making a living exclusively, in every profession across the board, people are doing many different things. So when we talk about the future of this company, we see a company that's growing when we have young people, young actors who have come to us who are interested in performing this for younger audiences. We see a tremendous hope for the future.
Perhaps, but you can't hear Yiddish on 2nd Avenue or East Houston Street today. So where can you hear it? Well, 30 years ago, I remember one place where the air used to be thick with the language. East 47th Street is the city's diamond district, and it doesn't seem to have changed. The signs in the plate glass windows give a clue. Kirschenbaum and Weisner, open Sunday, closed Saturday. Minche at 5:30 p.m. in the rear by Kirchschlag. Minche is the afternoon service, when the diamond dealing has to stop. But when they're not praying, they're haggling in Yiddish.
Ich bin ready zu kaufen die Steine, but give me davon einen besseren Preis.
No, wie viel offers denn?
10 above. 10 above.
No. Come on. Bianco.
Jacob Bander and Moshe Mosbacher, chairman and arbitrator of the Diamond Dealers Circle, demonstrating their dealing skills.
Was macht ein Geschäft jetzt? 14 Masal. Gib die Hand. Sei ein Mensch, come on.
Gib mir noch ein Prozent in Europa, gib mir mal so.
13,5.
13.
13,5 Masal.
13, bar mitzvah. 13.
Okay, 13
Masal.
What is the connection between Jews of predominantly Eastern European origin and the diamond business?
Years ago, I think historically, Jews were persecuted. In all countries, opportunity was not available to them. So they had no choice. I think it was more out of necessity than out of choice.
Why was the diamond business particularly safe? Why?
Safe because Jewish people historically would never know when they had to run. There was a knock on the door, you had to go out the back door and run out.
But why diamonds?
Because you would take whatever your possessions were. You didn't need a moving truck to take your diamonds. You put it in your pocket and you run. So it was sort of very easily transportable. And that's probably why, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm imagining that's probably why they ended up in the diamond business as opposed to the cement business.
Moshe Mosbacher. But 47th Street is a little Orthodox island in a sea of assimilation, with Yiddish as its private language. By the 1940s, the first generation of Yiddish speakers were in their 60s. Their children were drifting away from the faith, marrying out and forgetting what their parents called the Mamaloschen, the mother tongue. The Mamaloschen had become the Bubaloschen, spoken only by grandmas. And there were two further death blows. There was the Holocaust, of course, but there was also the new state of Israel, which from the very beginning rejected Yiddish because it was the language of the ghetto and replaced it with muscular, aggressive modern Hebrew. The academic Miriam Hoffman again.
The Holocaust annihilated, it killed out 6 million, of whom 5 million spoke Yiddish probably. So just by doing that, it's a killer to the language. Israel did not recognize Yiddish, and so they established Hebrew as their national language. Yiddish was poo-pooed, and assimilation was the third blow.
After the war, the circulation of the Forward Yiddish newspaper crumbled. It tried to adapt to a new world, but it was a losing battle. Sam Norwich.
The children of those immigrants, although they knew Yiddish, they were more literate in English. They'd gone to public school, they knew English. And they didn't need a Yiddish paper to orient themselves. They could pick up an English language paper. So there was an immediate generational split. So they've tried to include English in the paper as a way of attracting the younger generation. But Yiddish had another aspect to it, and that is it was stigmatized. It was stigmatized along with the immigrants, and it was never quite able to escape that stigma.
It's a paradox. On the one hand, the street culture was fading, but on the other hand, there'd never been more American writers with Yiddish flowing through their veins. Think of Bellow, Malamud, and Roth. One slightly younger member of that generation, the novelist Cynthia Ozick, is only too aware of how much was lost.
Language isn't only words. Language is life. Language is civilization. And if you kill a language, which almost happened in Europe, when so many speakers and readers and writers of the language were murdered, you also murder the language.
Which is why we're here in America. Nevertheless, America has also, and I'm interested in this contribution to the way in which Yiddish has survived, one of the ways is the absorption of the Yiddish language and certain aspects of Yiddish culture into general North American cultural identity.
You can go into any Midwest supermarket and find bagels galore, for one thing. And then, of course, the language. There's so many words. schmooze, kibitz, I can't think of them all now, but
Chutzpah.
Chutzpah, of course. And also, I would say certain gestures. There's something called New York mouth. It's a facial expression which, without a word, indicates doubt. I think you're off the wall. And New York mouth has spread through the United States of America. It's Yiddish. It's a Yiddish gesture.
Always a pleasure. This is 3. Do you want to go to 4? Well, you're a schmuck.
What would American comedy be without good Yiddish words?
Well, you know, it's fascinating that for most of the 20th century, most of the comedians in America were Jewish.
Another little island in well-heeled midtown Manhattan, the Friars Club, where comedians, many of them Jewish, like Freddie Roman, keep Yiddish humour alive. Can you tell us where the word schmuck actually comes from, what it actually means in Yiddish?
A schmuck is a term, let me get this as on an even keel as possible, for the male penis. That's as far as I'm going to go.
I was going to say, it also comes, I mean, Yiddish is from German, and schmuck means jewel or gem or something.
The man's jewel.
The man's
yes.
jewel. So it's a kind of, there's a joke within a joke there, yeah.
Exactly so.
But there are lots and lots of Yiddish words that have found their way into American, words that are used all the time.
Without a question. The
Give me some
word putz, which is another euphemism for the male sexual organ. And I was driving in a taxi cab 3 weeks ago in New York, and it was driven by a Pakistani. And a guy cut us off, and he went, "You putz." I said, "Do you know what you're saying?" He said, "No, but it feels good."
You were saying earlier on that it's amazing how many of that particular generation of American comedians were Jewish. What's your explanation of this?
Very simply, there was a resort area in New York State called the Catskills Mountains, made up of resorts that catered to Jewish people. From boarding houses, they got a little bigger and they became little hotels. And the more they became hotels, they had to have activities to keep their people happy. Well, in order to keep them from going to the next hotel down the road, they brought in an entertainment staff, of which 92% of the comedians were Jewish. And it was the birthplace for some of the greatest stars in American history. Danny Kaye, Sid Caesar, Jackie Mason, and the list goes on and on. It was endless.
But you needed more than a few aging vaudeville troopers to resurrect the corpse of the Mamaloschen. By the 1970s, Yiddish was on a life support system. One dedicated paramedic was a young academic called Aaron Lansky, who founded the National Yiddish Book Center nearly 30 years ago. He realized that thousands of Yiddish books were mouldering in attics and ending up in dustbins, so he scoured the country for lost literature.
A year after I began, this would have been in the winter of 1981. By that point, I was probably on the road 6 days a week, running around the United States and Canada collecting books. And I'm home, asleep at night, and suddenly the phone starts ringing. This is probably midnight. I pick up the receiver, and it's a friend of mine in New York City. And she said she had just heard that there was a garbage dumpster on the street on 16th Street. And as she described it, she said it's piled to the top with Yiddish books. And it looks like it's about to rain here. You have to come down immediately to save them. I had no automobile. I managed to catch a 2 a.m. train. I made it down to New York City at 6:30 in the morning. I go bounding out on the street. It's sleet and freezing rain. And there's a dumpster, all right, but this is a thing that's the size of a tractor-trailer truck loaded up with what turned out to be about 8,000 Yiddish volumes. It was only later I found out there had been a labor Zionist organization in the building nearby. Many years ago, they had gone out of business. They had left the books in a basement storeroom for safekeeping. And it was only now that the building was being renovated that for 3 days, workers had been hauling them out to the dumpster. I went to the corner payphone, called a few friends. They were all there within a half hour. We pooled our money. We rented a very large truck, backed it up to the dumpster, spent an entire day in the rain. We managed to save about 6,000 volumes. And I'm happy to say many of those books ended up at Oxford University. So our goal has always been to take books literally out of the dustbin of history and put them back into use.
But if all you needed to preserve a language was books, we'd still be speaking Latin. Still, there's one community which has diligently maintained Yiddish as its lingua franca, the ultra-Orthodox. Crown Heights in Brooklyn is the home of an Orthodox sect called the Chabad Lubavitchers. They still speak the tongue and wear the clothes of 19th century Poland and Lithuania. Walking from the subway to a local deli, it looks as if someone switched off the colour control. Men in black broad-brimmed hats with long, loose black jackets, black beards for the adult males and curly black sidelocks for the adolescents. The Lubavitchers are Hasidic Jews, and I've been told that Hasids are the fastest growing demographic in the USA. Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson is the editor of the Hasidic Yiddish newspaper, the Allgemeine. Its circulation is 4 times the size of the Forward. He believes that Yiddish is inseparable from the Jewish faith.
I would give the metaphor that I once heard from a mentor, a great rabbi, who compared it, in synagogues there's the Torah scroll called the Sefer Torah. And every Torah scroll has to be covered by a coat, which we call in Yiddish the mantel. It's a beautiful, beautiful coat that garbs, that encases the Torah scroll. I would say Yiddish is that coat that encased the Torah scroll of Jewry for more than 1,000 years. The Jewish people created, communicated, wrote, cried, laughed, wept, danced, exhilarated in Yiddish. So Yiddish is a language, I think, not only of words and sentences and phrases and syllables, but it's also a language that is like a body for a soul, in the sense that it was the body, the garment, the instruments that Jews for a millennia, used to live, to express themselves and to create some very profound ideas in Judaism and Torah and culture. It's the language in which the 6 million, most of the 6 million spoke, who perished. So I think there's something very valuable, historically, emotionally, spiritually.
Some people would argue that the most important thing that Yiddish has done here in North America is to enrich the language of American English.
Granted, I think it's a lovely thing, but if the whole value of Yiddish is basically that it gave a few cute words to English, I think that's a poor compliment for Yiddish.
Crown Heights is like one big yeshiva, a huge Jewish seminary. Inside the main yeshiva itself, you really are in another century. The sallow-skinned students with their sidelocks and skullcaps pore over the Talmud and argue theology in Yiddish.
Der sagt, dass es belongt zu seinen Eltern und der sagt, dass es belongt zu seinen Eltern.
At the turn of the last century, Jewish culture, Yiddish culture, because it was a much more Yiddish-speaking culture than it is today, in New York, in America in general, was much, much more secular. Why the change?
I think what happened was the immigrant generation was very Jewish. They grew up with Judaism, they breathed it, they smelled it, they had Shabbat, they had the holidays. They were in the shtetl where everything was Jewish. They came to America, they still maintained that consciousness. That's who they were. They couldn't tear it out of their hearts. Even what we call the apikursim, the heretics, the atheists, they were Jewish atheists. They were atheists with a religious fervor. It was a Talmudic type of atheism. They couldn't get rid of it. They took for granted the fact that they had a very intense Jewish education that they chose to leave. They thought it'll just get passed on through chicken soup and knedlach. And chicken soup is great, but it's insufficient to create a renaissance and to maintain an inspiration throughout life and to pass it on to your children.
But some of those children discovered another legacy, and it was a secular one. Klezmer music from the borderlands of Eastern Europe began to attract an audience in the 1960s, and some of them weren't even Jewish. One of the pioneers of New York klezmer is Alicia Sviegels, who's performing at this Brooklyn wedding.
I've always heard klezmer as a musical abstraction of the Yiddish language. And I think that that's true of all musical cultures. When I hear Greek music with those even, short, staccato syllables, to me it sounds like the cadences of the Greek language. And Irish music with the rolls and trills, they sound like the R's of Gaelic. And I really hear this in Yiddish as well. Like, there's a song I just did for Passover recently that went, werken, zogen, werken, zählen, was der eins beteilt, was der eins beteilt. Einer ist doch Gott, und Gott ist einer, und Gott ist einer, und weiter keiner. Werken, zogen, werken, zählen, was der zwei beteilt. Zwei sind die Liches, einer ist doch Gott, und Gott ist einer, und weiter keiner. To me, that sounds like the Yiddish I just spoke. Can you hear that, or am I imagining it? This is a Bela Gottesman lyric. It goes with a song, but I'm leaving out the melody now, just to demonstrate the Yiddish. Sie weiß dir, was tags is heint, sis ben Yomles bar mitzvah. Es wird kommen nonting gitte freint auf der größte Simcha. When klezmer instrumentalists play tunes, they're really imitating Jewish singing style, East European Jewish singing style, folk singing, cantorial singing. So a cantor might do something like bye 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 bye. Now, if you picked up a piece of sheet music and with a little with a short Jewish melody like this, and you didn't know how to play klezmer, you might go. Which I think to many people might actually sound kind of Jewish, even the way I played it, but it's not, because the real way to play it is. And this is the chas. You hear how it sounds like a cry, a sob?
So sein Shabbos, Tomit Shabbos, Shabbos auf der ganzen Welt. Shabbos, Shabbos.
Erev Shabbos, Friday night in the Schechter household. Father Binyamin is a composer of Yiddish musicals and popular songs. He doesn't just speak the language, he lives it, and so does the whole family. They sing Yiddish, they write Yiddish, and while they break bread for the Sabbath, the kids even text in Yiddish.
I have friends with whom I chat with on the internet and on AIM in Yiddish.
And you chat on the internet in Yiddish? Or
yeah.
How do you chat on the internet in Yiddish?
Transcripted.
You transliterate it, yeah.
Our cousin has created, like, there are a lot of abbreviations that are used in English, like LOL, which means like laugh out loud, or
and TTYL,
talk to you later, or things like that. So he created
all the stuff that you use when you text people.
Yeah, texting on instant message. So he created a whole vocabulary like that, or a whole terminology like in Yiddish for those.
So you've got Yiddish text language.
Yeah, like ZG is Zeigesind, and BS is bis später, or BSH actually.
Bis später a bit later.
Yeah, like
till later.
Until
later, bis später.
Hasta luego.
Yeah.
So do you text people in Yiddish?
I don't text that much. I did text you today.
You texted him in Yiddish or in English?
In Yiddish. I want to know if Mr. Diaz was here today.
We have the same Spanish teacher, and so.
So you're texting him in Yiddish about your Spanish teacher. I think that shows what a melting pot New York really is.
And on Manhattan's Upper West Side, you can glimpse yet another future for the language, this time in a typically messy student apartment. Once a week, a group of 20-somethings get together to speak Yiddish. They're not doing it out of nostalgia or religious fervour. It's not an act of cultural reclamation. They're holding a sviva, a social club, and their motives are political.
Growing up, it was always, well, there's nothing left of European Jewish culture, don't bother with it. And then when I was about 14, 15, I was clobbering around the attic. I found all these books. And I couldn't even read the alphabet. And I went to my dad and I said, I should learn Hebrew. I should learn these books. He said, not Hebrew, those are in Yiddish. And to me, it was just, I realized how disconnected I was from my own history, that I was blown away when I found out just 70 years ago there were 9, 10, 11 million people who spoke Yiddish.
I mean, I didn't really know anything about Yiddish at all, but I guess I, kind of thought it was just something that people stopped using and died out, and maybe it just wasn't worth anything. But when I found out the contemptuous sort of attitude that some people have about Yiddish.
Now, who are these people with a contemptuous attitude? Please tell me.
A lot of Jewish people. One thing I'm very interested in personally is genocides and language. I found a lot of people around the world after either genocides or mass death give up their language. An example from your part of the world is the Irish. After the Irish potato famine, people consciously associated the Irish language with starvation, and the number of speakers dropped off. And I see a lot of that with kids associating Yiddish with the Holocaust very strongly. I remember one time I was speaking in Yiddish on the telephone. At the same time, we were planning, this was when I was in high school, we were planning a Holocaust memorial program, and they said, don't you know Yiddish had a role in causing the Holocaust? And I said, what? And they're like, well, if Jews had spoken a stronger language and been stronger people, and I said, it had nothing to do with language.
Now, this is interesting. It echoes some of those remarks we've heard about Yiddish being stigmatized. The Holocaust didn't just kill Yiddish speakers, it killed the social continuity which kept the language alive.
It really strikes me as paradoxical that we do spend so much time talking about the Holocaust, and certainly growing up, I grew up in the 80s on Long Island, typical conservative Hebrew school, and the Holocaust was a very, very large part of our curriculum, and yet we learned absolutely nothing about the way those people live. So the paradox to me is, how can we say that we're really honoring those people if all we do is talk about the way they died? To me, that it's dishonoring them.
It's almost as if a famous person is murdered and they write, out of a 500-page book, 490 pages is on the murder. And I look at it that way. And to see my own culture, my own language portrayed that way, I get very angry.
It's the anger which fascinates me. Anger is here and now. It's far more naked than nostalgia. There's a younger school of American Jewish writers who've tapped that vein of passion. They've reached back 3 generations, not out of sentiment or loss, but in an attempt to pick up where their great-grandparents left off. Dara Horn is 31, and the 4th generation of her family to be born in the States. She's a novelist and an academic, teaching Yiddish and Hebrew. Her writing is full of echoes of the Yiddish literary past.
What's really interesting about Yiddish, Erica was saying, the first courageous soul to break the silence, is how much humor there is in it. What it really does have, he thought, is a world of the dead built into it, a true fear of heaven, an automatic need to invoke the presence of God whenever saying anything good or bad about anyone or anything, an absolute trust that the other world, if one could call it that, is not separate from this one, that eternity is always breathing over your shoulder, waiting to see if you will notice.
In her novels, Dara fashions a kind of Hamisher Jewish magic realism. Her world is full of living ghosts.
I think there is a longing for a connection to the past among people my age, and within Jewish culture among people my age, but I think also among people living a modern life anywhere. Because I think that there is a pretense in modern life that the past doesn't exist. It isn't true, because so much of who we are is made out of the people who came before us. Everyone who's come before us has left an imprint on who we are. What I discovered when I started learning Yiddish was the tremendous talent that had been forgotten. These people were tremendously effective writers, tremendously talented writers, writers who would surprise a modern reader, would shock a modern reader with what they had to say about the boundaries between this world and another world. And, and writing that from a secular perspective, writing secular, surreal stories. I mean, the closest person I can compare Der Nister to, I think, in writing that would be familiar to a general audience would be Kafka.
Dara Horn is building a bridge between past, present and future, a third way of keeping Yiddishkeit alive. It's the polar opposite of the Hasidic old way, which Y.Y. Jacobson feels that secular Jewish youngsters have lost.
The religious communities, the Hasidic communities, they came to the United States of America, but they did not take for granted that their children will just be Jewish because of the chicken soup. They created schools. And they gave their children an intense Jewish education. Hebrew, Yiddish, Bible studies, Mishnah, Talmud, Mitzvot. They kept Shabbat. They had mezuzot on the door. They kept kosher. They went to the mikveh, which is the ritual bath. They celebrated Shabbat meals. They went to pray. They created a Jewish life. And their children gave it to their children. And their children gave it to theirs. So today, 60 plus years after the war, what we are seeing is, tragically, that cherished, beautiful generation that spoke Yiddish and wrote in Yiddish and created theater in Yiddish left over no legacy.
Yiddish a century ago was sort of the language of progress. Today it's the opposite. Today Yiddish has sort of become a shelter and a way for very religious people to protect themselves and isolate themselves from modern life. I think that there's a third approach. I think that there's a way in which this culture can be, in some sense, mined for spare parts. That's a more negative way to put it, I suppose. But in a sense, that the ways that this culture can be harvested without using it as a shield against modernity, but rather as a root to it. And the way I think the root which I am passionate about in that is the literature. Because I feel that when you read this literature, it is a very modern literature. It's a literature that's very aware of the tension between religion and modern life. It's a literature that's very aware in a sense of the impossibility of belief.
I find that very appealing. The past not as a terrible genocidal burden, but as a hyperlink to a different future. I think that's what the young Sviva group are trying to touch behind all that anger.
There's so much memorializing about the Holocaust, and yet so few people know anything about who those people were. Mm-hmm. And to me, it became a way of keeping something about them alive. I learned so much about my family that died in the war, and I realized if they came back from the dead, I wouldn't be able to talk to them.
My parents told me that when I was 2 years old and my grandmother looked after me, I spoke as much Yiddish as English. Like all Jewish mothers, my Bubba feared we'd all catch cold and die. So my first words, so I'm told, were "Vermach de Tür," shut the door. Well, almost all that Yiddish is gone now, but the songs have stuck in my memory. Music is the DNA of memory. The Jews have lost many languages during their 2,000-year odyssey. Aramaic from the Middle East, Hakatia from the Arab world, Ladino from their sojourn in Spain. Perhaps Yiddish will follow them into the mists of history. But so long as there's Klezmer, I'll take a bet that the double helix of the Yiddish language will never die.